Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. Today we have a special session. It is a workshop on Hegel and the Global South, and we have two invited speakers, Mariana Teixeira and Viren Murthy. They will provide us with different perspectives on the reception of Hegel's philosophy in different parts of the world. So I will present them one at a time. So I'll start presenting Viren, who will talk now. So Viren Murthy, our first speaker, is a professor at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. He works on questions related to the historical conditions for the possibility of philosophy in the modern world, and particularly in East Asia. And he's currently working on the reception of Hegel in this part of the world. He has several publications, among which I would like to mention some that are particularly relevant for our topic of discussion today. Namely, the forthcoming article titled Rescuing Hegel from Eurocentrism, Oriental Reconstructions of Hegel's Orient, forthcoming in the Hegel Bulletin, and the recently published monograph, Pan-Asianism and the Legacy of the Chinese Revolution, published with the University of Chicago Press in 2023. So the structure for this first talk is as follows. So Viren will give a 25-minute talk, and we'll have a Q&A for 20 minutes. After that, we will move on to the second speaker, whom I will introduce then. So I see that all of you have switched on your camera, so that's great. And I also would like to mention that after the session, we'll have informal conversations. We'll stop the recording and we'll stay here for informal conversations. So you're all very welcome to stay. And so the title of Viren's talk is Rethinking the Orient, to Japanese Responses to Hegel's Philosophy of History. And thank you so much, Viren, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be here, Manuel, Louis-Philippe, and Karin. So I'm going to jump right into it. So I'm going to talk about sort of rethinking the Orient, to Japanese responses to Hegel's philosophy of history, something I've been thinking about recently. And the outline that I'm going to present today is fairly simple. I'm going to first talk about how we've been sort of confronting sort of historical narratives and Hegel's philosophy of history in general, in particular, rather. I mean, and that is this problem of linearity, right? And how people have responded to that. And that is especially the case when, we think about Asian studies, which is one of the places where I work. So then I'll move on to the actual responses to Hegel, and I'm going to entitle that Provincialization, sort of drawing on Dipesh Chakrabarty's well-known book Provincializing Europe. And so then I look at these two sort of precursors, I think, because they're writing much earlier than the rise of postcolonialism, and then I'll move to a conclusion. So first, the sort of introduction, and this I call Western civilization and its discontents. So since Francis Fukuyama's famous essay and book in the 1990s, right? The essay came out in 1989. There's been a certain backlash against progressive narratives of history. Fukuyama famously wrote, "The triumph of the West or of the Western idea is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism, right? And scholars in Asian studies have attacked this civilizational narrative. And I think this is the same for other non-Western regions as well. While at the same time, they're indicting some of the Hegelian roots, contending that such narratives are Eurocentric and legitimize imperialism. So take the following passages. I'm going to give two examples. So one is Mark Driscoll's recent book, The Whites Are Enemies of Heaven. And in that book, so these are not Hegel scholars, but they still talk about Hegel. And that's why I think the relevance of Hegel is goes much beyond philosophy departments. So he says, Hegel is confident that the trajectory of the white world spirit is indexed precisely to historical progress. For the first time, the strides forward of Europeans colonize every part of the earth. And now a book that you probably are more familiar with, Teixeira Tibebu, he writes about Hegel in the Third World, and he says Hegel invested a significant part of his formidable intellectual power to rationalizing Europe's global domination of the Third World. Hegel's philosophy of world history is based on a paradigmatic apartheid. So both of the above authors urge us to leave Hegel and give up historical teleology. So in light of such critiques, then how do we make sense of earlier anti-Eurocentric narratives that drew on Hegel, even if they're also sort of criticizing, right? The problem concerns how Hegel's philosophy of history stands in relation to more philosophical texts, such as the science of logic and the phenomenology of spirit. Can and should the philosophy of history be rethought without sacrificing the core of Hegel's ideas? Is this even possible? Is this something we would want to do? And that's, I think, one of the questions. I think what often happens in the Asian studies field is that we reject it all together. So to begin with my conclusion, the texts we will discuss today show a double crisis. One of linear or teleological historical narratives, and the other a crisis of the critique of teleology. So to some extent, we've moved from one crisis to the other. So, and this is something Benjamin Schwartz, a sinologist writing in the US in the 60s and so on, he says, well, he makes a distinction between historismus and historicismus. Now, whether that really makes sense is another story, but I think but it's a useful distinction conceptually, because he says, historicism responds, so that's pure historicism, responds to a crisis of historicism, historicismus, right, which is the teleological history. And we now have a crisis of both, which also suggests that the two might not be so easily separable. And this will make a little more sense once we get into it. So we might say that Hegel's Geist encompasses both. On the one hand, Hegel is criticized for being universalist, stressing Weltgeist. But remember that in the debate between the liberals and communitarians in the US, right, in the 1990s, the communitarians like Michael Sandel and others drew on Hegel to attack the liberal Kantians, right? And this again was a particular versus universal kind of argument. So the thinkers I will examine today posit community against the abstract universal history. Their discourse anticipates the idea of alternative modernities, which itself could be seen as a form of the narrative of community, right, if we're thinking of the first historicism. Now, the crisis of linear history, the historical narrative is clear, right? We talk about the civilizing mission, universalism appears connected to imperialism. However, the crisis of its dialectical opposite, namely the affirmation of particular cultures and alternative modernities, remains opaque. Now, according to some Marxist critiques, now this is the case for Harry Hartunian's Overcome by Modernity, right? And he says these unreflexive responses to capitalism and universalization, from the standpoint of particular civilizations, reconstitute capitalism in a fascist form. However, Hegel's historical teleology cannot be reduced to either fascism or imperialism. Consequently, the critics of Hegel in Asia, and Japan in particular, often return to Hegel during their critique, or at least Hegelian type narratives. And this often will make us often think of Foucault's famous passage about Hegel, that Hegel is there waiting for us just when we're criticizing him, right? And I think the Japanese story for sure sort of gives evidence of this. Okay, so now moving to the first part, responses to historical narratives. So provincialization and really provincializing Europe. So the two figures I'm going to talk about, Koyama Iwao and Mizoguchi Yuzo. So provincialization, and here I mean provincializing Europe, long before post-colonial theory, Japanese intellectuals attempted to provincialize Europe by pluralizing world history. So the first figure I'm talking about is Koyama Iwao. He is active during the interwar and World War II periods, and also the post-war context, but I'm only going to be dealing with the first two. And he's a philosopher associated with the Kyoto School. Now, some of you may know the Kyoto School, right? Japanese thinkers who were often influenced by Heidegger and Hegel, Sartre as well, and also combined this with Japanese philosophy and Chinese philosophy, and to some extent Indian philosophy and Buddhism and so on, to develop their own kind of theory. Now, Koyama Iwao is part of that school, but not one of the most famous proponents. Nishida is, Kitaro is perhaps the most famous. Now, in the 1940s, he publishes A Philosophy of World History, and this is in some sense a response to Hegel. The project was not only to think of world history from plural centers or modernities, but eventually to overcome capitalist modernity. And this, as we will see, was connected to the wartime project. Eventually, he thinks of world history from the standpoint of Japan. Now, in the context of Japan's rise to counter Hegel, Koyama draws on numerous German thinkers of the 19th and early 20th century to affirm the decline of Western civilization and to theorize capitalism within and beyond Japan. So here are some of the texts that he draws on, right? Oswald Spengler, Untergang des Abendlandes, Leopold von Ranke, but also lesser-known theorists of capitalism. We don't read that much, right? Like von Bellow and as Die Entstehung des Kapitalismus and Bücher, right? These are not texts we usually read that much, but he was trying to sort of use them to theorize capitalism. So, but the focus that I'm going to try to stress today is using Ranke to relativize Hegel. So he pits Ranke against Hegel to stress the particular. And here's a citation. He says, Hegel thought of histories as spirit's progress in its consciousness of freedom. Against this, Ranke believed that there was something that does not progress in history. And he contended that God connects directly to every period. But according to Hegel's philosophy, absolute spirit is simultaneously both in history and goes beyond history. Within progress, it connects to an eternal now. We, like Ranke, recognize that it is most important to see the eternal now in the realm of ethics. In the historical world, each period and nation has its completeness. And we'll come to this problem of completeness in a moment. But the problem here is he wants to make a separation between a movement and progress, right? And there are two different kanji that he uses for that. And with the idea of progress, he also is interested in criticizing Marxism. And this is his critique of Marxism, right? Which might be familiar to you, but this is happening much earlier than it often becomes when it becomes salient. He says, European theorists of world history thought that if we look at things from the progress of development, one can do nothing but approach European modernity. For example, Chinese society and culture is not yet in the medieval period, or at the highest, it is merely trying to enter modernity. Therefore, China must become capitalist. If not, going one step further, it must become communist. Such thinking usually starts from an unreflexive position where European culture equals culture. From such a standpoint, Russia attempted to jump to capitalism. So he attempts a different reading, right, with another goal of history, you could argue. And he wants to criticize the above standpoint as historical monism. He writes, we have to reject a non-reflexive monism, right? So that's where European culture equals culture. Right? This implies that we must pursue the plurality of historical times and historical cultures. He also splits Japanese modernity, right? This is Kinsei, understood in partly Weberian terms, so that's including rationalization, positivism, and urbanization. he says, actually, Japan has two modernities, one before the Meiji Restoration, right, 1868, and then one after. These two modernities differ in their outward appearance as the Asian Japan and the European Japan, but both are grounded in the modern spirit and are unified by this. Taking the Meiji Restoration as a turning point, the two modernities have a discontinuous continuity. So the point here, of course, Meiji Restoration is when, Perry comes in with the ships, right? Japan faces Western imperialism and then transforms. That's why the earlier modernity has an enormous significance, because that's, he's saying, is indigenous, right? Without Western involvement. So Koyama then draws on Oswald Spengler's that idea that civilization develops, declines, and ends, right? Now, Japan then needs to enter world history precisely because the West is dying. And it can do this because it has both the earlier modernity and then the new modernity, right? He appears to have moved from Kant and Hegel's respective systematic philosophies to critiques of civilizations found in Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, right? Both of whom argued about civilization declining. So, but he doesn't want to stop at mere pluralization. And this is where you could say there's a re-universalization or a re-Hegelianism. He says monism that is mediated by a reflexive awareness of the plurality of the world will avoid a monism that simply expands one's own particular principle of the world and unreflexively takes it to be a universal principle. He hopes to construct a new type of universality beyond reflexive monism of European historiography. To grasp this, we have to briefly examine the historical context. I'll go through this quickly. So if you want to talk about the actuality of Koyama's view, we have to think about, the China incident, the war between China and Japan. And of course, Pearl Harbor, which was, extremely significant for the Japanese, right? Because it's the Japanese bombing a major Western power, right? So he wants to say that the world war happening today is not just a war within modernity, but one that goes beyond the dimension of it. It is a war that appears to mark a new period beyond modernity. And so this is where you get the overcoming modernities, right? And he wants to say our mission connected with the Manchu incident, the decline of the League of Nations, and the China incidents is precisely to resist the European world order. So modernity equals the European world, and it's manifest in politics, society, and so on, right? Now, Japan represents a move beyond liberalism. So he says that, you've got Western science that's made all these incomparable contributions, but what they then hollow out is morality and humanity, right? And so that's where Japan can sort of bring both of these together, according to him. So here we can also remember the relationship between mechanism and life, right? Life being the truth of mechanism in Hegel's logic. So some of that is also at play here. Now, the China incident and other recent events were signs of a turn in world history. Koyama relativizes history via plural cultures to create a new universal way of life. The final version of universality would allow particularity to be realized within it. World history is fundamentally against homogenization. After World War II, right, of course, such a position is discredited, right? But has an interesting afterlife in Japanese sinology. So that's all I'm going to say about Koyama. We could talk more about him later. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second part, Mizoguchi Yuzo, right? Who develops a lot of Koyama's gestures, but now with China as its focus. So here's Mizoguchi Yuzo. His dates are different. He's writing largely in the 80s and 90s. And notice he's pointing to this character Gong or Ko in Japanese, which is the public, representing sort of community. So he was one of Japan's most influential sinologists in the 20th century and widely read in China, especially among the left. People call him a kind of proto-post-colonial. He came of age during the post-war and initially went to law school in Tokyo University to work in the government. However, he turns to the study of sinology largely because of the significance of the Chinese Revolution. There are major shifts in Japan during this period, which we can't go into in great detail, but you could say neoliberalism, restoration of diplomatic ties between China and Japan are important. And of course, Mao Zedong meets Tanaka Kakue in 1972. There's also neoliberalism, if you're interested. Yoshimi Shunya has a book on this. But there's a move away from teleology and linearity, which they saw in Marxism. So there is in 1980s a turn against Maoist China, right, because of the Cultural Revolution and so on and things like that. So here in this context, you could say there's a rethinking of Hegel on the Orient, right? The Oriental world at that point was considered, well, if you think about Hegel, right, it's where you have substantiality, but no subjectivity, right? So there's no will or subjectivity. However, the question is how closely to stick to the Hegelian narrative, especially as it emerges in the philosophy of right. The issue concerns the relationship between the substantiality of community that we find in the family and its negation that we find in civil society. Recall that Hegel himself outlines a logic of civil society that creates problems such as overproduction and the production of a rabble. The question Japanese sinologists then posed was whether China could travel another path while it's still achieving the same goals, right? The sort of reconciliation, individuality and community. So Mizoguchi's study of China must be thought of in relation to another sinologist named Takeuchi Yoshimi, who I've written about, who was also influenced by the Kyoto school. The specter of linear civilizational discourse based on the West haunted post-war Japanese sinology and Takeuchi as well. And consequently, China was seen as a space without modernity. And this is what the sinologists tried to resist. Takeuchi had a version of a response to this from a Pan-Asianist perspective, but not one that rejected universality. I talk about this in my book, so I'll briefly mention that. But here's a text that I'll at least read part. I'll read. So how much time do I have? What's my?
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay,
so it's
good.
25
Okay,
in total,
so
but you're fine. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna read this passage then. So the Orient must re-embrace the West, right? And I stress this because it's not saying that we want just a kind of an Asia, right, or Japan. It must change the West itself in order to realize the latter's outstanding cultural values on a greater scale. Such a rollback of cultural values would create universality for Hensei. The Orient must change the West in order to further elevate those universal values that the West itself produced. This is the main problem facing East-West relations today, and it is at once political and cultural issue. Japan must grasp this idea as well. When this rollback takes place, we must have our own cultural values, and yet perhaps these values do not already exist as substance, right? Rather, I suspect that they are possible as method, that is, as the process of the subject's self-formation. This I have called Asia's method, right? And it is impossible to definitely say what this might mean. So Mizoguchi then criticizes Takeuchi, right? Because he says that, this is a China without China, right? So because China goes from being stagnant a la Hegel to becoming pure movement, right? That's why he says there's no substance, right? It's only there as subject formation. Now, he attempts to uncover the internal logic of Chinese intellectual history. And here he responds to someone else who tried to do this, Shimada Kenji, right, who talks about the setback of modern Chinese thought, who says that modernity emerged in China, but then it suffered a setback, right? Now, the issue there, of course, is when you say it's a setback, you're already using Western modernity as a standard. He tried to show that just like the West, China developed, but it's in a kind of individual subjectivity, but it suffered a setback. Shimada tried to show that the various parts of modernity existed in pre-modern China without forming a whole, so unlike in Europe. Now, this is Mizoguchi's response, right, in probably his most famous book, The Development and Refraction of Pre-Modern Chinese Thought. Shimada Kenji, like Theodore de Bary, did not grasp the historical specificity of Chinese development, according to Mizoguchi. So he argues for a different modernity in China, beginning in the Ming-Qing periods, but drawing on the Song as well, with a specific focus on intellectual history and the emergence of different forms of equality and subjectivity. Recall that the dominant interpretation in Hegel, right, the Orient lacks individuality. Mizoguchi counters this by showing the emergence of subjectivity in Chinese history through sublations of previous periods. Mizoguchi underscores that Chinese revolutions, such as 1949, of course, is the major one, do not represent a break, but actually sublate their own past. They continue the trajectory of the past. He contends that the rural village space, right, embodies philosophical concepts such as that of community. So what you have is the individuality emerging, but unlike in Hegel's civil society, it's not completely alienated from community. So he goes, without getting into the details of this theory, he goes into the history of Neo-Confucianism through a kind of Hegelian lens, right, focusing on sublation of earlier periods. But his analysis of the Ming Dynasty thinker Li Zhi is the key issue here is the opposition between the universal principle, right, which universal equality, and individual desire represented by these characters. So he contends that Shimada fails to see the organic unity and the shape of the Chinese spirit. Rather than place Tianli and individual desire in opposition, one must think of how they were reconstituted and reconciled in the Ming, so that they were not completely separate but mutually mediated by one another. So in Mizoguchi's view, Li Zhi's thought, in his thought, the elemental imperative becomes conscious of itself through heaven, right, through the universal. The resulting sublation then connects individual to community in a way different from in civil society and the state. Put simply, the trajectory of Chinese history has the goal of attaining a situation where the concrete singularity of each is the condition for the possibility of the flourishing of all. He complicates Koyama's position by rethinking modernity through China. Now let's talk, I want to end with just a few limits to this approach. Now, to use Hegel's phrase out of context, this is where Mizoguchi, out of fear of the object, retreats. Remember, and this is Hegel's critique of Kant, right? He says critical philosophy gave to the logical determinations an essential subjective significance out of the fear of the object. Here, I'm going to say it's the fear of the universal, right? Mizoguchi shows us the limits of his historical approach when dealing with the problem of global history, the object from which he retreats. The sublations that he uncover and end up describing the universal, but only within a particular civilization. And so then he says what we need to do is construct a new universal based out of all of these particulars, right? So the nation state, or perhaps the region, becomes the unit of analysis. Thus, his universality or totality ends up becoming an agglomeration of particulars. Now, in short, Mizoguchi has reproduced the whole in Hegel's doctrine of essence. Remember, this is in his discussion of ground, right? He says, this is Hegel says, well, the whole thus constitutes of the parts. Apart from them, it is not anything. It is therefore a whole relation and the self-subsistent totality. But precisely for this reason, it is only a relative. For what makes it a totality is rather its other, the parts. It does not have its subsistence within, but in its other, right? And so this is the type of totality that he sees, he sort of envisions, right? Almost like a global multiculturalism. But this is not what makes Mizoguchi's position attractive. Rather, he argues that China bypassed the alienation of civil society to unite community and individuality without negating either, right? And I think that's what made so many people drawn to his thinking. So now I'm going to conclude with a summary of the main points. So responses to Hegel attempt to both liberate the particular from the abstract domination of the universal and then recreate the universal from a new perspective. So are such alternative narratives doomed to recreate fascism or even forms of imperialism, a la Koyama, right? Because he supported the Japanese empire, right? So are these just various themes on von Hegel to Hitler? One must distinguish then between the negation of liberalism and the sublation of liberalism. In the latter, the ideals of liberalism remain in concepts such as individual desire and so on in Mizoguchi, but now they are harmonized with the community. But for Mizoguchi, this results in a particularity, right? It is only the story of Chinese civilization and believes that the universal must be constructed through the agglomeration of civilizational histories. One could reconstruct Mizoguchi's position to account for both contingency and normativity at two levels. One level is contingent, namely that the historical structures were behind the promotion of individual interests and so on. The other is normative, namely the project of harmonizing or reconciling principle, Tien or heaven, community, and the individual. This, at some level, is like Fukuzawa Yukichi's ideal of civilization, right? Which is transcendent but serves as a standpoint of critique. So I'm going to just end there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Viren, for this very rich talk. So the floor is now open for questions. We have about 20 minutes, so please use the raise hand function here in Zoom. Or if you cannot find it, just send me a message via chat or just raise your physical hand and I'll be able to find you. Yeah. So, yeah, Karin.
Yes, thanks for this very interesting talk. So much of the information was completely new to me. So I'll try to address something that I can relate to, namely this idea that a culture should try to harmonize individual interest and community. Yes, that you discussed in relation to Michiguchi.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, so let me put it this way. I think that we can learn from the philosophy of right. Yes, and I don't know if in the Japanese context they focus a lot on Hegel's philosophy of right. But I think we can learn from Hegel's philosophy of right that it's extremely difficult for a modern political community to harmonize individual interests and a sense of community, or in more abstract terms, particular interest and universal interest. Of course, it depends on how you read the philosophy of right, but it seems to me that Hegel doesn't really, give us a kind of a recipe for accomplishing this harmony. And I was wondering whether these Japanese scholars were more optimistic about the capacity of a culture or of Japanese society to harmonize individual interests with the interest of the society as a whole, or whether they were more pessimistic, or whether they also responded to Hegel's philosophy of rights as regards this issue.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I mean the simple answer is of course yes, but the complex answer is really how and why, and also how one reads Hegel on this, right? Because I think one of the places where and this actually would go back to something I watched from your earlier workshop when Stephen Holgate was on the at your workshop, right? Because he brought up the problem of das Pöbel, yeah, the rabble, and he was saying, yeah, that looks like a big problem, but it's really the corporations can solve it, right? And there was a discussion about that, and I think that the Japanese readers, to the extent that they're reading Hegel's philosophy of right, because some of them are reading other texts as well, like the philosophy of history and so on. But to the extent that they're reading of philosophy of right, they're closer to Holgate. They're on the optimistic side, but they also agree that the civil society. I mean, in this sense, they're sometimes closer to Marx, right? Because they don't think that the state can solve the problems of civil society, and they're not as optimistic about the corporations. So here, Koyama and Mizoguchi both have different perspectives on this, and this is where. So for Koyama, it's really the Japanese that are going to be able to do this, and we have to think about this in the context of the war. So some of this is a little scary, right? I mean, I didn't bring out the scariness of this because they're saying it's the emperor who's going to actually do this and so on and all of that, right? Now with Mizoguchi, it's a little more complicated because he's not looking to Japan; he's looking to China. Right. And he's saying that, well, one of the things we have to do is look at how, within the Chinese context, the individual emerged, but it was an individual that always already had community within it. Right. So one of the reasons he says that the Western individual, there's this big problem is because the individual emerges as an alienated individual in civil society, right? Someone pursuing their own interests. Well, if that doesn't happen, then all of a sudden the problem looks different, he says, right? So and remember that he's historically trying to explain why China became socialist, right? And so China becomes socialist in that context where you don't really have an intermediary sort of position, right? And then later on, people criticized the socialist states for that as well, right? But he's almost looking at almost in an optimistic kind of way that maybe they could find another way to solve the problem. Do you see what I'm saying? So this you can find this response in other places as well. Like if since I'm sitting in the South Asia Center, I should say probably something about South Asia. But if you think about Partha Chatterjee, right, in his response to Charles Taylor's view of civil society, Hegel's civil society, he says, but in the colonial context, what happens is the substantiality of the family becomes much more important. And so you don't have that intermediary realm, but you might still have individuality there. And I think Hegel might say that's impossible, right? And I think that's going to be the interesting question, right?
Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Megan?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your talk. I actually it's more like a clarification question, and slightly related to Professor De Boer's point about how in the individual community reconciliations are being seen by the Japanese thinkers, and it was about about Koyama's view. The part that I missed was that there were these two modernities, the pre-Meiji modernity, and I was wondering two things about that. That exactly how was that early modernity being thought? Let's presume that the later modernity kind of sounds like the European one, the after the Meiji. But so just what is being thought over there? And secondly, um, is there any sense in when Koyama is looking at Hegel that, because you mentioned Ranke, and that at least that came about for me, when, looking at these turns in world history rather than seeing it as just this big one line, and Ranke is at least trying to look at these turns, in my view. And so when Koyama is looking at Hegel's philosophy of history, is he seeing something like signs of multiple modernities in that? Because to me, even when reading Hegel's philosophy of history, it's not always one block. And you see him dealing with these tensions, and he himself has to just keep making it one clean line to, settle the movements. But he is often anticipating, he is often seeing certain movements connected with certain others, and those are present questions in the historiography of the time. The relations between Greek antiquity and Indian antiquity, and so on and so forth. And so he is having to deal with those in my overall view. And so I'm asking if Koyama is looking at something like multiple modernities in Hegel himself. So yeah, about those.
No, that's great. So that's great. So let me just take the fundamental question about the two modernities, because I think that's the heart of the issue, and it's one that becomes really important later on in scholarship too, right? Because if you think about the whole problem of early modernity, right, we have to ask, like, why is it that scholars of India, scholars of Japan and China are all interested in early modernity, right? And in some sense, Koyama is a precursor to all of that. And the reason is because he says that one is you don't have the Western sort of influence, right? So you can say this is an indigenous modernity, and indigenous, but they want to say it's indigenous, but not only that, in some way they also want to say it's better. Now, what are one of the reasons that they want to say it's better? One is because you don't have a global hegemon, right? Their argument is that it's not like you have imperialism that gives you all these modernities. These sort of emerged according to them, right? And the other is perhaps the nature of that modernity itself, right? Because they want to say that the complete alienation of capitalism does not happen. So it becomes a modernity in some sense without capitalism. And notice that you have versions of this in Western Marxism as well. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Ellen Wood, right? So Ellen Wood makes a big distinction between modernity in England and modernity in France, right? And one of the problems she says, well, in France, you have modernity, but you don't have capitalism. And that allows for more kind of egalitarianism and so on. And she has a whole reading of Rousseau is coming out of that, right? Now, that might sound strange to us, but for the Asians, that's what they were always doing. That's what they were always trying to say, is that, yeah, we have a modernity, but without the without the radical alienation. Now, to what extent is this in Hegel? For Koyama, I think he reads Hegel as having a strict hierarchy, so that he does have something, that Hegel does see, the Orient as having a universal significance, right? Even when he says one person is free, it's that freedom that develops, right? So that freedom is of world historical significance. But there is also a sense in which that freedom can't develop in Asia, right? It requires Europe to complete it. And that's where Koyama then wants to split history that way. I mean, so it becomes a bunch of multiple modernities that then unite, right? Because of the historical circumstances of imperialism and resistance, right? So yeah, so that's just a partial answer. Yeah.
Okay, so this is all very fascinating, but we now have 4 more questions and about 10 minutes. We can go a few minutes over time, that's fine, but let's try to keep the questions focused and the answers so that we can cover all questions.
So we maybe, if we have only little time, shall we maybe take the questions together? So
no,
I don't want to take.
We can go one by one. Let's
Okay.
just try to keep it focused. Yeah, Kinney.
Okay.
Okay, really, really fascinating talk. And I just have one question about one small point that you raised. So when you discussed Koyama Iwao's philosophy or his response to Hegel, you mentioned that he discusses the rise of Japan in the context of the decline of the West. And you seem to suggest that this brings him closer to Nietzsche and Schopenhauer rather than Hegel. But I'm just thinking Hegel also has a theory of decline, right? Like when he describes the movement from the Oriental world to the Greek, to the Roman, and then to the Germanic. So each rise of a new form of spirit, right, or a new nation that embodies world spirit is accompanied by the decline of an old form. So I'm just thinking like maybe even that point is in continuity with Hegel and not necessarily against it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there I'd agree with you. It's just whether you can apply that decline to the West, right? And I think that might be the big difference, right? That yeah, there's some people who interpret Koyama that way as well. That they say, well, in the end, he just replaced Japan with Europe with Japan, right? In some ways, but it's a little different because there's a kind of because there's that plurality. There's at one point a total plurality. Right, and I don't know if Hegel has that where you can have plural modernities, right? I think so. So I guess the big difference is the overcoming of modernity idea. Do we want to attribute that to Hegel as well? I think it's possible, but it's a complex question because how do we read Hegel there, right? Is he, because he's read both ways in some sense. Some focus on Sittlichkeit and say, well, Sittlichkeit is actually a critique of modernity, And then there are others who say, no, 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 but Sittlichkeit is actually the realization of modernity. And I think that with Koyama, it's extremely clear that what we need to do is overcome modernity, right? He was part of that big round table, the overcoming modernity with a lot of the Kyoto school people sort of participated in. But that's a good point about the rising and the falling. I think that's there in, and he's getting that from Spengler, but it's also there in Hegel, right? That the rising and the falling. But I guess the big question is the end of history, but I don't want to say that Koyama doesn't have the end of history, because in some sense it is. The World War II is that big end, right, for him at that time, right? Yeah.
Great. Lucas.
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick. Thank you for this very interesting, very fascinating talk. A question I would have is whether maybe those authors, they somehow remain hostage to Hegel, so to speak, in this discussion. Because it seems to me that you are still assuming something such as modernity plays a significant role in understanding history, in the sense that somehow there must be some sort of development that gives rise to this conception of the individual as a person and so on, and how do you conciliate this with community. But it seems that one of the things we could very much critique is this very idea that we have to look for a modernity, whether in Europe or elsewhere. And we have to assume that this development is necessary and happens at some point in history. If you take David Graeber, for instance, in his The Dawn of Everything, he precisely tries to show that this narrative about how humanity developed from hunters to farmers to and so agriculture gave rise to civilization is very problematic, and that even our conception, our modern conception of the individual freedom actually arises in response to indigenous American critiques, which aimed precisely at the fact that in Europe you didn't have individual freedom, and at the same time you didn't have this connection to community in a way that you can rely, anyone in the community can rely on the other. So I guess, to put it shortly, I guess my question would be, shouldn't we criticize the very idea that modernity is a key concept that we have to use in order to read history as such?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that more than Koyama, Mizoguchi has faced this criticism quite a bit, right? Because he's saying, why are you looking for modernity in China, right? Because they're saying, you should just give it up, right? Why? Because the minute you're doing that, you're already buying into the Hegelian idea, right? And he's had a difficult time responding to that, right? So the things that, but here are some of the responses is that one of the things he wants to say, and a lot of this then becomes a historical question, right? Then we get into, well, do we see the emergence of something like the individual emerging, right? In say the 17th, 16th, and 17th century China. But the other thing is our own normative position. If we give up modernity, what else are we giving up? Are we going to give up the ideal of the reconciliation between individual and community? Are we going to give up even the ideal of freedom as an ideal, right? I mean, is that, because I noticed even in your response, one of the things you were saying is that, well, the indigenous communities were involved in this, in the emergence of the idea of freedom or something like that. But in that sense, you haven't given up the ideal of freedom. You're actually legitimizing the indigenous communities because they've participated in this, right? So I think that we're in a kind of catch-22, right? I think that in some sense, if we really want to give it up, then we have to say, no, well, we don't want it then. But then we really have to face the consequences then, I mean, of that, right? And there are those who do, they say, well, yeah, freedom is overrated, right? Like we have that discourse in China right now, right? Because there's a whole theory of we're all under heaven that says, democracy is overrated. Look what happened in the US. You have democracy and now you've got Trump, right? So in some sense, it's better not to have it, maybe, right? But is that where we want to go, right? Do we have that? I mean, that I think is the choice we'll have to make.
Okay, great. Ryan.
Actually, for time's sake, this is perfect. Lucas basically asked my question, so thank you.
Okay. If you have a different question, we can do it. That's fine. Sure? Yeah? Okay, good. Marie-Louise?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for this. I know these thinkers only through the work of Naoki Sakai, so that's probably a relatively critical angle already. But that made me think, one of his critiques is that there is, well, on the one hand, you brought this up, very much firmly an idea of the nation state as what gives unity to the subject of history, at least in Koyama's thought. But then secondly, that there is also actually an extent to which this alternative modernities narrative has to forget the way in which Japan geopolitically is, if not in the West, then in a privileged position in relation to the West. And I wondered what you made of this line of critique of his work.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm also an avid reader of Sakai's work, and he's written, interestingly, he's written on Koyama to some extent. He's written on Takeuchi, but not on Mizoguchi,
Exactly,
which is
yeah.
kind of interesting, right? And that's partly because it's usually the China scholars who focus on Mizoguchi, but I think the relation between the three is kind of interesting because so Koyama is unproblematically a supporter of Japanese imperialism. And so in that sense, even if he's anti-Western, that anti-Western sort of stance is implicated in imperialism in Asia, right? And so that is the trick with dealing with Japan. They're anti-Eurocentric, but as they're anti-Eurocentric, they're also invading their neighbors, right? And when they do that, of course, this is why you can understand why they were so enamored with the invasion or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because the people, there's one intellectual, Shimizu Ikutaro, who makes a famous statement. He says that, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, for me, it was like taking a crap after a long bout of constipation. And the reason for that is because all these Japanese intellectuals were all saying, okay, we want to be anti-West, but all the Japanese government was doing was invading all these neighboring territories, right? And so finally, when they attacked the US, there was a kind of relief. But nonetheless, that was all connected to the same project, right? Now, Takeuchi Yoshimi, when you look at, he sort of then comes in the post-war and has to deal with this problem, right? Because he's a Pan-Asianist, and he has to say, well, what happened to all this stuff? Or what were we doing, right? And he says, well, what we have to understand is that the anti-Western part of that rhetoric or that project is not false. Because in the post-war, American imperialism is stronger than it ever was. After all, Japan was occupied, right? And so he then calls the Koyama position imperialism against imperialism, right? So it's one imperialism against another imperialism. That doesn't make it correct, but you can begin to understand it. Now, Mizoguchi is a bit of a different breed, right? Because what he's then now looking to is not Japan, but China. Now, you could argue that it's still the nation state, but the nation state is always qualified by a kind of region, right? And I think this is connected to our this very workshop, right? Because notice that it's called the Global South, right? So when it's called the Global South, what that is saying is that, okay, it's the nation, but beyond the nation, there's some kind of unity that we're talking about. But notice also that it's called the Global South and not the Third World, right? With Mizoguchi and Takeuchi, the Third World was the category that they were much more interested in. Now, why the Third World? Because the Third World was considered to be a kind of resistance to the West, right? And that resistance combined a kind of nationalism, right? Because the nationalism was a necessary moment of the resistance to imperialism. you can think about it this way, and this is what a lot of the Indian intellectuals, Chinese, often say, right? I mean, in Western academia, it's very easy to criticize the nation state because US imperialism would love that there aren't any nation states around, that they're very weak nation states, right? Remember, as the US was invading Iraq, one of the things they said is, we don't like Iraqi nationalism, right? Now, because in the resistance to imperialism, that is a necessary, that's an important moment, because we don't have at this point other structures that resist, right? And then but the problem, of course, is to go beyond that, right? And that's what I think the third world as a concept was doing. Now, I think the reason why we are now moving to the global south is partly because after the 1980s, that project sort of unraveled. And today we have, there's a big question. Can you still say China's global south? Is it third world? So on. Is Japan, like in Japan in this case, is a very tricky perspective, right? Because it tried to unify with the global south when actually you could say that it wasn't, right? It was actually imperializing, but not completely, right? Because it also faced imperialism in 1858, right? So that's what I mean. So that's what I would say. I realized that was a sort of a circuitous response to your question, but to summarize it, I think the first would be to sort of qualify the critique of the nation state, to be careful about what nation state we're criticizing, and is the critique of the nation state a rejection of the nation state? But the final point, and I'll end with this, is I agree with you at this level, right? Because in the end of my presentation, when I criticized Mizoguchi's position, right, it was not that it focuses only on China, but that its significance is also then he wants to restrict it to China, right? And I think that's where he doesn't make the much more difficult move of universalizing. But that was, I would get back to Karin's point, because once he makes that universalizing move, he has to face the philosophical questions, right? Well, the intellectual historian, to some extent, can always say, no, I'm just talking about China, and I'm not going to tell you about, how difficult it is or how you make that. I'm just going to say, well, this is what the Chinese did, right? And then leave it to you to try to sort of figure it out, right? But I think, yeah. So, but I don't know if that at least is the beginning of a response.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but very fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, and I second you. This is really fascinating, and thank you so much, Viren. And we will now move on to the second part of the workshop. And our second speaker of the day is Mariana Teixeira, who is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Lisbon. She works on Hegel's legacy in contemporary philosophy, from the standpoints of class, gender, and race, and particularly Marx, Kojève, Simone de Beauvoir, and Fanon. She has also authored several publications, among which I would like to mention some that I take to be particularly relevant today. A forthcoming monograph titled Misplaced Dialectics, Masters and Slaves in Hegel, Kojève, Beauvoir, and Fanon. It is forthcoming with Routledge. And an article recently published titled Hegel from the Margins, Notes on Fanon's Reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit, published in the Hegel Jahrbuch in 2024. So the structure is the same. Mariana will give a 25-minute talk, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. And the title of Mariana's talk is 3 Ways of Dealing with Hegel's Racism, Conversion, Inversion, and Subversion. Thank you, Mariana, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luis, for this kind introduction. And thank you also, Karin, Manuel, and Luis for the invitation to talk. in the Leuven seminar. I'm very happy to present this work here and to hear your feedback. This is an ever work in progress, I think, so I'm very happy to discuss it with you. I see some people here in the audience that have heard some version of this paper at some point, and they might notice that I have changed some things, because in every presentation, I think I learn a lot, and I'm sure that this will be the case as well. Also, I have learned a lot already from Viren's presentation, and I think there's a very interesting dialogue that we can establish between our papers, I hope. So I will share my screen, and you let me know whether you can see it. Yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So in order to keep with the time, I'm going to read my paper. So let me briefly outline the broader context of this paper. As already mentioned by Luis Felipe, my current research deals with what I'm calling reading Hegel from the peripheries or from the margins. And it is inspired by the provocative notion of misplaced ideas that was proposed by the Brazilian scholar Roberto Schwartz within the debate about the epistemic and political relations between the center and the peripheries of world capitalism. And this became a very, very heated discussion within, especially Latin America. Schwartz points out that ideas, hegemonic in the center of the system, are often transferred to and imposed on the peripheries. He is discussing specifically European liberal principles, especially that of universal freedom, and its quote unquote improper application in the European colonies, that is mainly, he's talking about Latin America and specifically Brazil of the 19th century, societies which are ostensibly based on slavery. Schwartz's argument is that in this misplacement in the margins, something is revealed about the center itself, its dependence on the periphery and on its unfreedom, as well as the contradictory character of ideas that are, or seem to be, in their proper place when they are in the center. Hence, many tensions of the peripheries are manifest versions of contradictions that are also present but rendered invisible in the center. The standpoint of the periphery, with its misplaced ideas, is not therefore that of categorical errors. On the contrary, it harbors a rich epistemic potential to bring to light the tensions and interdependencies between the particular and the universal. So my current project is to use this framework to understand how the critical appropriation of Hegel's master-slave dialectics in the works of Kojève, Fanon, and Beauvoir can illuminate Hegel's own formulation, its powers, and its contradictions, and as already mentioned, it's forthcoming with Routledge next year, and I've slightly changed the subtitle. Now it's called Subverting Hegel with Kojève, Beauvoir, and Fanon, and I think by the end of the talk, you realize why I use this subtitle now. So in this paper, in this talk, I set off from this theoretical impulse to focus specifically on the Eurocentric and racist aspects of Hegel's philosophy. And just a disclaimer I'm taking here, Eurocentrism and racism very interconnectedly. I won't get into the differences or the history of these two concepts or these two terms, but I'm considering that Eurocentrism is inherently racist, and I'm considering Hegel's philosophy, at least the affirmations that we have in the philosophy of history, as both Eurocentric and racist. We can discuss, we can see, and I'll present some of the arguments against considering it inherently racist or biologically racist, or we can even excuse, some people excuse this racism, but I don't think it's tenable to say that these affirmations are not racist, but that's something that I'm setting off from. My question is, what can we learn by reading Hegel from the peripheries? Is his philosophy inherently Eurocentric, or can the Eurocentric aspects be relinquished with no harm to the system? So let me already advance that I will not give an answer to these questions here in this moment, or better put, I will not give one answer, but rather many possible answers, because my intention here is to map the existing interpretations of one of the most controversial aspects of Hegel's system and to understand what is at stake in this debate that has been gaining enormous traction in recent years. Indeed, many have been increasingly pointing out the Eurocentric aspects of traditional academic settings and the philosophical canon, challenging the presumed neutrality of hegemonic forms of knowledge, which present themselves as universal while relegating all otherness to the realm of the particular, the inessential, the insignificant, and often also to the camps of the dangerous and harmful, that which must be controlled and ultimately eliminated. But this project is not monolithic. There are different paths and strategies adopted with the aim of countering this epistemic Eurocentrism. This paper offers an interpretive framework to understand these different strategies, and the criteria, like how to differentiate them that I'm using here, is their philosophical assumptions regarding the relationship between marginalized and hegemonic forms of knowledge. So in the first part of the paper, I will present the strategies of, first, the conversion of marginalized knowledges to a higher status through their inclusion in the pantheon of hegemonic knowledges. Secondly, the inversion between hegemonic and marginalized knowledges, with the former being replaced by the latter. And third, the subversion of hegemonic knowledges by the marginalized ones through the unveiling of the asymmetrical and authoritarian interdependence between them. After a systematic examination of these strategies, in part 2, I will apply them to the different attempts to address the Eurocentric aspects of Hegel's philosophy. So let's go to part 1, the 3 strategies against epistemic Eurocentrism. So the conversion, what I'm calling the conversion model, aims to combat Eurocentrism by including a diversity of voices and perspectives in the knowledge production process. It challenges the traditionally white European canon by valuing the contributions of marginalized groups. This model takes 2 main forms. Firstly, it seeks to make visible the significant contributions of marginalized groups to established forms of knowledge. In this vein, for example, many recent projects highlight the participation of silenced voices in the history of knowledge production. Secondly, the conversion strategy also values forms of knowledge production that go beyond the hegemonic canon based on Western rationalism. This includes, for instance, incorporating previously excluded theoretical frameworks into educational curricula, such as Amerindian, African, and diasporic epistemologies. And the goal here is to create a more comprehensive theoretical repertoire that recognizes and legitimizes marginalized knowledge forms. With this, also, the hegemonic forms of knowledge would be enriched. This we can see in many attempts, for example, to highlight the contributions of women to philosophy or of African philosophers. This would be the first form of this strategy, and the other one, or the idea is, these people can do Western philosophy too. They also have contributed to it. And the other way is to value different forms of knowledge, not to include these people, marginalized people, into the canon, but include different forms of knowledge themselves into the philosophical canon. So the conversion model strives for epistemic diversity, elevating marginalized knowledges to the same level of legitimacy as hegemonic forms of knowledge, which are now hegemonic forms of knowledge, which is taken as true, but limited and in need of complementation. So the presupposed relationship between hegemonic and marginalized forms of knowledge is that of a parity which needs to be recognized. The inversion model shares the diagnosis of a systematic devaluation and exclusion of knowledge produced by marginalized groups. However, it goes further than the conversion model by considering hegemonic knowledges as not only incomplete, but also more strictly false. This model challenges the universality claimed by Western rationalism and identifies the exclusion of the other as an inherent characteristic of hegemonic knowledge. In the inversion model, it's not enough to include marginalized knowledges alongside hegemonic ones. We need to unveil the necessary falsity of the knowledge based on silences and exclusions. This model calls for elevating marginalized knowledges to a position superior to that of hegemonic knowledges, considered as permeated by Eurocentrism, and argue for a more holistic epistemic perspective found, for instance, in traditional communities and the practices of marginalized groups. In summary, the inversion model aims to displace hegemonic knowledges and replace them with the marginalized ones. It seeks to create a theoretical framework that is not only more comprehensive, but also more genuine and adequate for understanding the relational nature of the world. Hegemonic knowledges are considered incomplete and false, and priority should be given to marginalized forms of knowledge. The third model, the subversion model, also acknowledges the unilaterality of hegemonic knowledges and their role in exploitative power relations associated with Eurocentrism. But unlike the conversion and the inversion models respectively, the subversion model proposes neither to elevate marginalized knowledges nor to entirely discard hegemonic knowledges. Instead, it seeks to unveil the ways in which marginalized knowledges are already present in a repressed form within hegemonic knowledges themselves. The subversion model recognizes that hegemonic knowledges have historically appropriated and relied upon the practical and epistemic contributions of marginalized groups. Material conditions of knowledge production, including capital accumulation and social reproduction, have largely been dependent on the labor, activities, and knowledges of marginalized groups. Moreover, in order to reclaim universality, hegemonic knowledges rely on the negation of the particular. Just as without the margins there is no center, without the other there is no self. The hegemonic knowledges are unable to recognize that they too are another, the another precisely to that which they exclude from their scope. They conceal that they too are particular, situated, rooted in the social conditions of the historical present. They are thus false, not because of their particularity and situatedness, but precisely the opposite. They are false because of their ill-fated claim to neutrality, universality, and self-sufficiency. So unlike the other two strategies, the subversion model does not aim at a reorganization of the relationship between hegemonic and marginalized knowledges, either to place them on the same level or to elevate the latter above the former. In both cases, these forms of knowledge remain unchanged in their internal structure and in their mutual exteriority and impermeability, even if their relative position in the hierarchy of epistemic validity changes. Subversion recognizes their interdependence, which is an asymmetrical and pernicious one. The goal is to expose and challenge the hidden dependence of hegemonic knowledges on exclusionary and violent practices. It is important to note that while crucial, this recognition alone is not sufficient. So it's not enough to say, oh, marginalized knowledges are already part of, in some way, of hegemonic knowledges, so you have to celebrate that. It's not enough to do that. Concurrent transformations are needed in the broader social structure, including political and economic dimensions, to redress Eurocentric social and epistemic relations. So let's move now to the second part of my talk, where I'll try to analyze Hegel's philosophy using this lens. So in the second part, I try to provide a concrete example of these strategies by focusing on Hegel. Many authors have pointed out the Eurocentric aspects of his philosophy, most notably his lectures on the philosophy of world history, where one can find extremely derogatory statements about non-European peoples, such as the native populations of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Hegel states about the African continent, for example, that it, I quote, has no historical interest of its own, except the fact that there we see men in barbarism, in savagery, unquote. In Africa, quote, there can be no history proper, unquote, because events follow each other arbitrarily and capriciously. There's no finality, no state, quote, no subjectivity, but only a series of subjects that destroy each other, unquote. Africa is, quote, the infant land, kinderland, shrouded beyond the day of self-conscious history in the black color of night, unquote. It is the place, quote, where the highland principle, that of the impossibility of culture, predominates. And the term that is being translated here for impossibility of culture is Unbildsamkeit. So it's not that it's ungebildet continents or people. They're not educated. They're uneducatable. Statements such as these can no longer be swept under the carpet in Hegel scholarship, which poses the question of how to redress the Eurocentrism of the Western philosophical canon, of which Hegel is an eminent figure. Let's see some strategies that have been adopted for this purpose. So the first, let's go to the first approach to counter Hegel's Eurocentric statements, which is to contextualize them within the broader framework of his philosophy. By relativizing their importance and even their authenticity, the aim is to rescue the core of Hegelian philosophy from what is understood as an occasional Eurocentrism. This strategy has probably been the most common among Hegel scholars for a long time. In most cases, it seems to be merely presupposed, or it appears on footnotes and introductory remarks to Hegel's writings. A central point emphasized from this perspective is Hegel's decided refusal of the biological determinism that has taken shape in the pseudosciences of phrenology and physiognomy, for example, in the phenomenology of spirit. It is commonly stressed that Hegel defends in turn a universalist conception of humanity by asserting that, I quote, man is rational in himself. Therein lies the possibility of equality, of the right of all men, and the nullity of a rigid distinction into human races with and without rights, unquote. With the growing literature pointing to Hegel's Eurocentrism, some interpreters have also begun to look more closely at this question, even addressing the philosopher's most problematic works in this regard. For Joseph Macartney, for example, and I'll point to this discussion between Macartney and Bernasconi in Radical Philosophy that took place in 2003. So for Macartney, for example, Hegel draws in his philosophy of history an important distinction between the nation as a natural entity, the nation, where belonging is determined by birth and is thus closer to the notion that we have of race. And so nation on the one hand, and people as a spiritual entity on the other, the folk characterized by a culture. There is history proper for Hegel only when spirit escapes from the bonds of nature, represented, for example, by blood relations and common ancestry. Thus, the subjects of history can only be spiritual entities, a people, and not natural ones, nations, tribes, castes, or races, which would mean that history, in the Hegelian conception, could not be understood through racist categories. One indication that Hegel's philosophy is not inherently racist, Macartney claims, is the fact that he recognizes that the art and religion of ancient Greece, an important turning point for the advancement of spirit, were significantly influenced by Egyptian and possibly Ethiopian culture. And we can also point out to Hegel's praise of India and China at some points. Andrew Buchwalter is another interpreter who seeks to elevate non-European peoples to a status analogous of that of the peoples of modern Europe in Hegel's philosophy. He recalls the importance of that Hegel attaches to the autonomy of the other in the process of achieving one's own autonomy. I quote Buchwalter, as we know from Hegel's epistemology and social ontology, both of which are based on contributions of intersubjectivity, the assertion of the autonomous self-consciousness of a being, whether an individual or a group, is unintelligible without the recognition of the self-consciousness of another, unquote. So Buchwalter applies to communities what Hegel says about the formation of individual subjectivity in the phenomenology of spirit, so that freedom properly realized in a community is intertwined with the freedom of another community, and even with the formation of a global culture and a shared sense of global identity, a Weltgeist. Buchwalter further recalls what Hegel states about colonialism in the philosophy of right, where Hegel says, I quote, the liberation of the colonies is itself revealed as the greatest advantage to the mother state, just as the liberation of slaves is to the master. Unquote. Lastly, Nicholas Moad adopts yet another strategy and argues that in speaking of Germanic peoples, Hegel is not talking about empirical persons belonging to the German nation. The Germanic spirit is in principle supraracial and supranational. In reality, it is nothing more than the spirit of modernity and the openness that characterizes it. So I'll quote Moad, the apex of Hegel's, quote, racial and, quote, national hierarchy is thus a non-race and a non-nation, a spirit and a culture that are beyond race and nationality, having freed themselves from these and all others merely natural determinations. Unquote. The need for an anti-national nation is something that Moad considers structural in the Hegelian system, unlike his identification of certain parts of Europe as filling this role, something, I quote, on whose correctness, the fundamental integrity of the system does not depend. So for Moad, the fact that Hegel identified this principle with Germanic peoples or with his Europe in his time does not undermine the structural principle that is behind it. So despite resorting to different arguments, the common theme here is that Hegel's philosophy does not inherently exclude non-European cultures from world history. To decolonize Hegelian philosophy or to criticize it, to rescue it from its Eurocentric aspects would therefore require an effort to separate its fundamental structure, with emphasis, for example, on the universalism and reciprocity that characterize Hegel's conception of the human, from those incidental moments in which Europeans appear in his lectures as the bearers of the most advanced version of the development of spirit. The task then would be to explicitly convert non-European peoples into parts of Hegel's theoretical scheme, which needs to be supplemented and thus made richer and more comprehensive, but does not essentially lack transformations in its most fundamental structure. There's also, I didn't go into more detail here, but one of the arguments also is to question whether Hegel himself actually is the author of those sentences, the most egregious and racist sentences that we find in the lectures in the philosophy of history, considering that they were annotations by students. So we cannot categorically attribute those sentences to him. But let's go to the second strategy of inversion. A second way of dealing with Hegel's Eurocentrism refuses the possibility of separating the whole of his philosophy from the more overtly racist propositions found, for example, in the lectures on the philosophy of world history. It is necessary not to complement or adjust Hegel's contribution, but rather to denounce and reject it as a whole, seeking alternative philosophical approaches. Many authors in this category focus primarily on developing competing proposals rather than unpacking Hegel's Eurocentrism in detail. However, a growing number of interpreters have conducted a more thorough analysis of Hegel's Eurocentric assumptions and their pervasive presence, or their alleged pervasive presence, throughout his philosophy. Robert Bernasconi is one such interpreter and has extensively examined Hegel's racism. He highlights how Hegel's philosophy aligns with the mid-19th century trend of organizing history around the concept of race. He concedes, as McCartney defends, that Hegel distinguishes between race or nation, on the one hand, as a natural entity, and people as a spiritual one, but he recalls that for Hegel, not all races or nations can become peoples, which results precisely in the exclusion of Africa from world history. Bernasconi also challenges the argument used to relativize Hegel's Eurocentrism, which insists that the reason for the philosopher's prejudiced statements is that the sources to which he had access at the time tended toward a totally stereotypical characterization regarding African populations, or other peoples for that matter. From an analysis of the works of travel literature mentioned by Hegel, Bernasconi argues that rather than having been a hostage of his sources, a child of his time, Hegel actually seems to have at times even exaggerated the stories reported. So he contributed to this narrative instead of being a hostage to it. An even more radical formulation of the critique of Hegel's Eurocentrism is found in Ferit Guven's text, 2006 text, The Dialectics of Racism, for whom the Hegelian method is itself inherently colonial, not only the statements in the philosophy of world history. And I don't go into more detail here on other authors that have also been defending this more recently, but I can mention Reiterada, and more recently also Rocio Zambrana, that tried to show how Hegel's overall system and method is inherently anti-Black in the case of Reiterada. I'll focus here in this earlier version of this argument. This Eurocentric character for Guven thus would not be just confined to sparse statements found in his students' notes, but would reach its deepest foundations. Guven points out that initially Hegel's model of subjectivity seems to be a promising alternative to the modern and atomistic conception of the subject, who constitutes itself by excluding and dominating its others. So the atomistic modern liberal conception of the individual. Hegel's conception seems to be a good alternative. The specificity of the Hegelian model of subjectivity, on the contrary, is the necessity of the dialectical relation with the other, of mutual recognition. The Hegelian subject, I quote Guven, can incorporate, lend a voice to, and accommodate its other, not in terms of a static confrontation, but as a dialectical movement that becomes the other, passes through negativity and returns to itself, and thus constitutes the subject's own subjectivity, unquote. For Guven, however, this impression is misleading. The Hegelian model of the subject actually features the very problems in the relations between the self and the other in general, and between the colonizer and the colonized in particular. Firstly, because the possibility of dialectical movement is attributed by Hegel to only one type of subject, namely the European, who is capable of change, diversity, and transformation, and is not in a standing still time like other peoples. Moreover, in the colonial system, the dynamics of the dialectical formation of subjectivity conceals an insidious relationship of domination, as the colonial power not only excludes and dominates the other in a direct way, but also defines this other, gives it a specific voice, and thus defines the possibilities of existence in, and even the resistance to, the colonial system. The power of this system, says Guven, I quote, has to be measured today by its ability to incorporate its other, situating it precisely and insidiously in terms of the possible opposition to the system, unquote. European privilege is thus the ability to assimilate and incorporate that which is different from it, so that, I quote him again, Hegel's conception of the subject, far from offering a possible framework for thinking a post-colonial notion of the subject, is the most sophisticated, most inescapable, and thus most insidious expression of colonialism, not so much in what it says, but in what it allows its other to say. End of quotation. In spite of their differences, these authors argue all that Hegel's Eurocentrism is not an incidental aspect that can be overlooked or relativized. Hegel's entire theoretical edifice would be committed to the racial prejudice that is expressed most openly in his writings on the subjective spirit and in his lectures on the philosophy of history. And even the dialectical method itself is often taken as a theoretical expression of Eurocentrism by postulating an otherness that is then assimilated. These authors advocate for an inversion that gives visibility instead to other philosophical frameworks, especially those from the regions that Hegel considered less advanced in the development of spirit, or even outside the history of the development of world spirit, such as Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Simply converting these alternative schemes into parts of the Hegelian theory, they are too capable of doing philosophy, is deemed insufficient. Rather, his entire framework must be challenged and eventually abandoned. Now I go to the third part, and I have one of the authors that I mentioned here in the audience, or at least she was here when I started, so yeah, this is always awkward, but let's see what she thinks of how I characterize her work. The strategy of subverting Hegel's philosophy for its turn requires more than complementing it with perspectives absent in his discourse, nor would it be productive, on the other hand, to simply discard it altogether and value in its place a multiplicity of previously silenced perspectives. The subversion model demands showing that Hegel's philosophy conceals that instead of the universal, it is itself a particular moment, in turn dependent on other particular moments that it insists on excluding. Revealed in its limitation and thus its falsity, Hegelian philosophy is appropriated and transformed in a way that allows for its critical spark to come to the surface. We can illustrate this stance in the works of Martinican authors Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon with the help of Jamila Mascat. In her paper Hegel and the Black Atlantic, she argues that Césaire's and Fanon's engagement with Hegel should not be seen as mere assimilation. Instead, they subvert Hegelian ideas to serve their anti-colonial and anti-racist perspectives. Hence, Césaire, for instance, with his concept of négritude, and the idea of the re-rootedness in blackness, in the particular, against alienation, assimilation, or dilution in the universal, strongly resonates with the language of Hegelian dialectics, but now with an anti-colonial perspective. Fanon, for his turn, famously reworks the Hegelian dynamics of recognition within the colonial context in Black Skin, White Masks, emphasizing the anti-colonial struggle as the key to liberation and the reconstruction of humanity. And we could go further, we can discuss further Fanon's appropriation and rearticulation of Hegel in the Q&A. If you are interested in that, that's what I've also been working more extensively. So the disruptive turn of Césaire and Fanon, who are of course not only commentators of Hegel's philosophy, but they're philosophers of their own, and they're proposing their own philosophies, setting off or in a sense engaging Hegel's philosophy. This disruptive turn that both Césaire and Fanon apply denaturalizes Hegelian dialectics and reorients it towards blackness and anti-colonial revolution. Jamila Mascat refers to this relationship with Hegelian philosophy as an intellectual cannibalism. Mascat thus suggests that by unveiling the falsity of Hegelian philosophy's claims to autonomy and universality, a more comprehensive conception of liberation can emerge. Subverting Hegelian philosophy transforms it into something different, rather than either complementing or replacing it with previously marginalized perspectives, but in any case leaving it unchanged. So to conclude, I'd just like to say that hegemonic forms of knowledge are facing a crisis that is rooted in their own contradictions and alleged universalist claims. This crisis opens possibilities for transformations, but also risks reproducing exclusion, violence, and exploitation. So it's therefore essential to examine the available strategies, their assumptions, and their practical implications. And by refining our understanding of this proposal for what could be called epistemic decolonization or the critique of epistemic Eurocentrism, we can better identify the tools and pathways for action. My aim is not to propose a single superior approach. Of course, I have my preference, as you probably realize. But I think that each model has its place depending on the object that is being criticized and the context. But the idea is to outline a framework that can be adapted to different contexts and is capable of fostering intersections among the diverse projects of epistemic and political resistance. So I think that maybe if we focus on these kinds of assumptions between the relationship between hegemonic and marginalized knowledges, we might be able to discuss not only the issue of Eurocentrism of the canon, but also the misogyny of the canon, and maybe establish connections between these different and others forms of exclusion that we find in the philosophical canon, maybe we can draw some bridges using this this framework. I'm not sure if we can do that, but that's my hope, and that's what I'm aiming at with this paper. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments.
Okay, Mariana, thank you so much for this very rich talk. Could you perhaps stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we already have 4 questions, and Jason raised his hand even before you finish your talk. So I think this is the first one for us. So that's very good. I think he has a very urgent question for you. So Jason, please.
Very urgent, very urgent. Hello again, Mariana. And I just wanted to thank you for the very, very helpful, more maybe descriptive what's going on. And I just wanted to hear more about how you're thinking in especially prescriptive terms. So you said, you have some preferences. I'd love to hear about those. Interestingly, you also said that maybe each of the 3 approaches has something going for it. So I wanted to know about that too, if possible. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to see you again. Yeah, so I think the third model of subversion, I think it's very interesting, very demanding as well. I don't know if at the end of the characterization of the subversion model, I mentioned that it will never be complete without further transformations also in the structures that lead to the situation. So I cannot say that any one theory or any one author has completely subverted Hegel's philosophy if the conditions that the social conditions that led to this form of exclusion are still in place. So it relates to, and I think this poses the whole question of the relationship between theory and praxis, which is not entirely, I think, spelled out in the paper because it's also not entirely clear for me. But I think this is a very interesting approach, a very nuanced approach, and in a certain sense, a very Hegelian approach, which is also, it's kind of ironic because it's very connected to the idea of dialectics and determinate negation. So I see this, and I'm very interested in Hegel, so I think this model is very interesting. However, I also think that it's not always the case that we can subvert an author. I think we can subvert authors that have interesting things to say, but there are some authors that have to be simply replaced. Like there's simply a defense of colonialism, this current idea now of clash of civilizations, or the theory of the great replacement, whatever, this should be replaced for other theories. Or inclusion is also, or the conversion is also important. For example, to highlight the contributions of people that have been integral parts of the formation of what we have now as the philosophical canon, but they're not recognized. So I think, for example, the contributions of women. So yeah, I think they all have their place, but I'm more interested at this point in the subversion model. Especially I'm working with Fanon and Beauvoir. And the reason I think that it interests me a bit more is because I think it's important to like contextualize what Hegel said and to see that it's not, I don't think it can be simply discarded like the second model would imply, specifically with regards to Hegel. Nor is it enough to kind of defend Hegel all the time. I don't want either to defend him nor to discard him altogether. And I think that there are some people, or many people actually, that have been engaging with his work in a very productive and subversive way. So I think he gives us a very fertile and productive material to do that. So I don't think it's very useful to simply do either of the two options. I think we have a lot of material there to go further than Hegel himself. Thanks for the question.
Great. Lucas.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for this very, very interesting, very important talk. I was wondering because when you talked about subversion, you said that although you use the author in a way to think something that he did not propose, in whatever case, it's like the two positions, the marginalized and the hegemonic position, they remain unaltered, like they remain the same. And that made me think whether this is not problematic, also whether we could not think of a fourth approach in a sense. And I couldn't come with a better name for it, but that would be something in the sense of a revision, in the sense that you look at the self-understanding of those traditions and you put that in question in such a way that this transforms our understanding of both of them. Like when we look back into history and you can say, oh, but Hegel had no, one thing is the Western tradition, the other thing is the Eastern tradition. One thing did not have to do anything to do with one another. But then you can look and say, no, actually, those ideas that you're claiming that are Western or whatever, they are also here, and they actually played a major role in like I was talking of the indigenous traditions. So these changes are very understanding of what those traditions are, of what those thinkers are. And I think this is very important in a context where we discuss history of philosophy, for instance, because one of the most interesting applications here is that comes to my mind is to say, because there's also this discussion, should we talk about indigenous philosophy? Because philosophy is a Western term that refers to things that were done in the West. But actually, if you question this self-understanding about what philosophy is, you see that it's very problematic, that before the 19th century, most manuals of history of philosophy, they claimed that philosophy had its origins in the Orient, in ancient Egypt or whatever. And you had a different understanding of what philosophy is. So I'm not sure, what do you think of that? Whether we could include this in subversion, the idea that this can change our very understanding of the authors or the traditions we are connecting, or whether we could maybe think of a fourth approach where we aim to change our very understanding of what those traditions are.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for this question. I would say that I'm totally in favor of how you propose to see this, like to re-illuminate how we, when we start to put these things in connection with each other, we see them in a certain way. Afterwards, we see both of them also in a different way. I would say that that's what I mean with subversion. I don't think it's a fourth model. And I can say that this happened like when I was reading Fanon and Beauvoir to see how much they departed. I started the research like trying to see how they depart from Hegel, the differences. And by rereading Hegel, and after having read Fanon and Beauvoir and having to go through Kojève to do this, so I realized, of course, they are engaging with a very Kojèvian reading of Hegel. They're not engaging directly or purely with Hegel, but a certain reading of Hegel that was very popular at the time. And some of the criticisms that they don't make like a criticism of Hegel, but they talk about how the original equality between the two poles of the master-slave dialectics are not applicable to the relations between men and women and Black colonized people and the white master. In many respects, they're actually criticizing a Kojèvian view and going back to Hegel and illuminating the importance that we have in Hegel of not pointing only to the resolution of the conflict in the end of the book, in the spirit chapter, and then absolute knowledge with true recognition, but the necessity of dwelling in the position of the natural consciousness that has not attained absolute knowledge and that is experiencing the point of view of the conflict, but with a view to the telos. So different from Kojève that insists in the unilateral resolution of the conflict. So that really, just to illustrate how that changed my view of Hegel himself, because now I don't think that Hegel, or an interesting reading of Hegel, is that he's not really saying that we, after absolute knowledge, throw everything away or look at natural consciousness as someone that is learning and will eventually come to mutual recognition, but to take it seriously and to dwell in the position of natural consciousness. And I think they're really living it in their historical moment for certain groups. So I would say that it really aligns with what I'm proposing here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so same as I said before, we have 4 questions in about 12 minutes, so let's try to keep it focused to cover all of them.
I apologize
we,
if
we can, we can go we can go a
over-
few minutes over time, so let's try to keep it focused. Inigo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria, for the presentation. I also had a very specific question. I mean, I loved everything. I love mapping what people think and why they think it. But with regards to the conversion strategy in particular, I find it very interesting that, for example, so Ter Pinkert says, you know, he falls within this camp, absolutely. But the reason he does that is that he says Hegel is not racist, but he's Eurocentric, right? So there's this sense that you can accept the Eurocentrism charge, and that is kind of fixable. Whereas racism would be sort of, you know, unfixable in some sense, right? To me, it seems like some of these strategies, you know, rely on making distinctions between Eurocentrism, racism. There's also a lot of people who are talking about like, well, could Hegel be pro-colonial but in a non-racist way? What would that mean? You know, all these things, right? So I wanted to sort of I find your sort of typology very interesting, but I want you to maybe see if you could say something, right? Because I sort of agree with what you said at the beginning, right? Sort of to be Eurocentric is a kind of racism, right? You can sort of frame it in one way or another, but that seems really immaterial, right? It seems to be giving the racists a sort of a credit that they don't deserve to say, oh, they're merely Eurocentric, right?
Mhm.
So I wanted to maybe hear a little bit about sort of this question, because I think a lot of these authors, they're sort of having the debate at a different level, but maybe they wouldn't be convinced about that equation. So maybe I don't know what you would say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Inigo. Thank you so much. I think Alison Stone also proposes a distinction between biological racism and cultural racism, and says that Hegel is culturally racist but not biologically racist, which I think makes sense given his denouncing of actually like pretty harsh denouncing of phrenology and physiognomy and so on. I think that both people that try to separate Eurocentrism from racism, to kind of say that Hegel was only Eurocentric but not racist, and the people that say, no, he was racist and therefore we shouldn't engage with him, I think both share an underlying assumption that philosophers should have an unambiguous and pure, perfect position on everything, and they're looking for that. So some will try to show that in his core he's not a racist, and the others ones will show that in his core he was racist. But I think they share more in common than they would like to admit. What I am interested in is not what Hegel inside his head really felt or thought, but what he wrote resonated with his time and how we deal with this today. So Bernasconi, I don't agree with everything that he says, but one point that I think he makes that is very interesting is that this discussion is not about the beginning of 19th century. This debate resonates with what we are living now, when to win an election, a president says that Haitians are eating dogs and cats. So all of these inform our discussion about this, and how we interpret Hegel today says a lot about that as well. So I'm not that interested, and this I think was clear from the paper, in giving a final judgment on whether Hegel was truly a racist or not. But how is our contemporary academic environment dealing with that? Thank you.
Great. Jamila.
Hi, Mariana. Nice to see you. So thank you for putting me in the club of the subversive. I mean, I take it as a compliment. I have a few, question. I mean, some scattered thoughts, but maybe I'll just focus on the question. The first one is about the notion of the misplaced dialectics that you take from Schwartz. And I was wondering why this misplacement, why it's not simply a relocation, so like a replacement or displacement, whether this that has some sort of negative connotation, if you could explain also what it means in the way in which you use it. I mean, take it from Schwartz and use it for your misplaced dialectics. The other kind of question is connected to the tripartition that you proposed, that, I mean, if I had to relate to this division, I would say, drawing on Spivak, that conversion would be excusing, inversion would be accusing, and subversion would be abusing. And I mean, going back to Spivak's idea, neither excuse nor accuse, rather abuse. And I was actually thinking why you are connecting those three positions with the notion of true and false. Basically, if I understood you correctly, in the conversion approach, the idea would be hegemonic knowledge is true, and in the inversion approach, the idea is that hegemonic knowledge is false and therefore unreformable. And then in the subversive approach, that the idea that hegemonic knowledge is true and false. I was really trying to understand why this idea, because I don't know, my first thought would be, it's not so much whether it's true or false. I mean, not to say that biological racism is true or is some ground in terms of truth, but maybe the sort of historical truth depends on the power structure that made those knowledge hegemonic. So I'm wondering how you really understand or conceptualize this idea of truth and falseness in relation to this concept. And then maybe I was thinking if there is some sort of normative idea as if one should subvert, because, for example, since I felt kind of interpolated, like for me was more this sort of eureka moment, looking at how many Black authors from the Global South have been investing in Hegel, being interested in trying to read, and actually had very interesting sabotage or uses and abuses. And I mean, I'm not sure if the only way to engage with Hegel is subverting it, or any sort of, modern author that could be like Hegel, accused of many things. So I was wondering if you actually, I mean, your idea is to characterize subversion as the approach, or the only approach that one could have vis-a-vis the legacy of modernity. For sure, I found it very productive, but I found it in other holders. I'm wondering, what does it mean for us, for example, like as readers, to say we are those who are subverting Hegel today in our reading practices, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you so much. The question of misplacement, I actually was discussing this because the word, the expression in Portuguese is ideias fora do lugar, which means out of place ideas. And it was translated into English. The book, which contains this essay, was translated into English as misplaced ideas, and with the input of the author. So the author was on board with this. And I like this because it emphasizes that it's not only out of place, it's not only a displacement, but it's a misplacement, in the sense that in his theory in particular, the ideas of universal freedom do not align with slavery. So it is not only a traveling theory in Said's terms, for example, but it's going to a place where surely appears not to belong. And of course, you have in Latin America a lot of people that criticize Schwartz's idea, precisely saying, no, there is freedom. There was freedom here. What is out of place is Europeans bringing slavery and together with it, their conception of abstract freedom. But the provocation is precisely that. It's a kind of ironic misplacement, because by being misplaced, and I think this is an epistemological provocation that I like very much, the margin as a site of radical openness, all this discussion about how when you destabilize the center and you go to these peripheral positions, which I think Hegel himself also proposes in different places the importance of this. Take the position of the slave or the serf in the bondsman in the Lord Bondsman dialectic, regardless of what happens afterwards. There is this moment of going to the side of objectification, of being the passive agent of a relation of domination, and the powers, the epistemic, at least openness that comes with it, without idealizing it, romanticizing it. That's a danger that, of course, has to be on the horizon. So I would insist on the misplacement, because I think that points to this, with this hint of irony. True and false, I think that's a very good point that I hadn't thought about. I think it's very Hegelian, because I'm taking true and false also in the sense of being not only like epistemically true and false, but also being wirklich, like being in a certain sense effective and corresponding to its own concept. But I'll reflect more on that, because I think it really might be misleading. And I'm also like very influenced by the idea of that the false is a moment of the true. So I think it's a very technical Hegelian and even Marxist or Lukácsian discussion that it's not entirely spelled out. And lastly, I think on the normative duty to subvert, I don't know, I think the idea of cannibalism that you propose, that is something I think, as I said, some authors and some ideas are worthy and are a productive ground for us to do that. Others aren't. And then we should adopt other strategies. So I think there is place for all of them. And it's important to know what to apply to each context. I don't mean that everyone has to classify things as in this typology before doing things, but this is how I'm making sense. And I think that some authors should be treated in different ways depending on how it resonates or not with our context. But thank you very much.
Great.
Helps me to clarify a lot.
Great. Nora?
Yes. Hi everyone. Thanks for organizing this session. It was really, really interesting, and also your talk was extremely thought-provoking. I have a question that comes from a kind of phenomenological perspective, I guess. It's kind of also the environment in which I'm working, and there's very much this idea present that intentionality is key. We cannot engage with anything without taking something as something. And by taking something as something, we kind of always we include certain perspectives, but we also necessarily exclude others. So there's this idea that self and other are always already, intertwined, co-constitutive. And I am I wanted to just pick your brain on what would be distinctive about that, let's say, colonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial relation. What would be distinctive that is worthwhile engaging with that specifically from this phenomenological perspective, because I usually get this kind of response that it's just another version of inclusion, exclusion, self and other being co-constitutive, and I'm thinking, no, there is something that is specific about this relationship, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that specific nature of the colonial. Yeah, let's put it.
Thank you. Another excellent, challenging question. I think that the broader framework that it's in the background here that I mentioned in the beginning, and that Jamila also mentioned right now, this idea of misplaced dialectics that is in the context of the Brazilian debate and Latin American debate more broadly, that is trying to understand what is our place within modernization and within the formation of capitalism through colonialism. And I think that like since many decades, so before what we have now as decolonial studies, for example, we already have this, because we have a lot of influence from the Marxist, the Hegelian Marxist discussion when we're thinking about the critique of capitalism from Latin America and how to understand our position as a slave-based society based on the labor of enslaved populations in a moment where capitalism was developing. So even in Brazilian literature, for a long time, we had been considered feudal remnants that would be superseded, overcome by capitalist relations. There was a whole reaction to that. We have the dependency theory and other people working on this, saying that no, colonialism is not, and slavery and racism are not outside, like they're not pre-capitalist, but they're integral part of the formation of capitalism. So colonialism is not, capitalism didn't happen in spite of slavery, in spite of colonialism, but through colonialism, slavery and racism. So it's this insistence that I think you're right, that the self and other are intertwined, and capitalism is not possible without this other of capitalism, that it poses it as the system of free labor, even in Marx. And there's then the whole discussion about primitive accumulation, but it's try to solve this puzzle. How can we situate ourselves within this, the emergence of capitalism with this considered pre-capitalist relations. So I think the debate is very broad. Was very like trying to synthesize a bit what is at stake, but I think it's a very interesting. I think you touched on something that interests me a lot, which is to understand that dependency theory does not only point to the fact that countries that were colonies remain dependent on imperial potencies after independence, but they remain dependent on our contribution to the world economy as well, through, for example, commodities and cheap labor. So I think showing this interdependency is crucial for this discussion. I know I haven't touched maybe on the points that you were more interested in, but that's how I could address that right now. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful session. I'm so sorry that I had to press you about the time, but it just shows how stimulating the entire session was. So thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Viren. Viren had to leave, but thank you both for this very nice and productive session. So please join me in thanking both our speakers and everyone for the discussion.
Thank you so much for the questions and for the opportunity.
Great. So I will just share here the link of the Leuven seminar. So we have our final session. I think it is a session on Kant on moral sensibility by Natalia Palatnik. And so we will now wrap it up, but we will keep the Zoom meeting open. So please, if you have time, please just remain online so that we can have more informal conversations. So thank you so much, and see you soon for the next session of the Leuven seminar.